All right, so the agenda today, we're going to get the 2.4 quarterly monitoring report update from Aaron, as well as some information on penalties and late fees, receivables, and then we're going to have Jeff Ohm from IT and Bo Forbert from Learning Services come in and talk about some 5C mill levy spending, which will be important because the FAC does a presentation to the board. It's scheduled for May 1st. And at the end of the meeting, when we're in the work session, we'll talk about some volunteers. Hopefully 2 or 3 of you will be able to attend that meeting, but we'll talk about that more towards the end. So I'm going to go ahead and mute. Aaron, take it away. Do you want me to share my screen? Do you want to share your screen? What's better for you?
And share your screen.
Okay. You want me to pull up the presentation?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to mute and start pulling up that presentation.
Morning, everyone. And for those of you who have the pleasure of not knowing me, my name is Aaron Oberg. I'm the Director of Finance. And what we want to just walk through today is a very quick overview of 2.4. And so it allows you to ask any questions that you have, and overall also to then dig a little deeper into a few sections of 2.4. As Gina said, one of those will be receivables and one of those will be the late fees. We walked through this presentation with the board. So we're sharing a little bit of the same information that we've already shared with the board. It also gives you an opportunity to see what we shared with the board and what individual questions you have. As you can imagine, many of the board members didn't necessarily ask the type of questions that you might have. So we'll just walk over quick the agenda of this particular report. This is what the board does. You all already know this. What we wanted to do is within 2.4, there are 16 or 17 or 25, or there's a lot of sub bullets within 2.4. Yet within 2.4, there are really 5 overall buckets to 2.4. Those buckets deal with our reserves and fund balance. They deal with our cash, including investments and liquidity. They deal with the sort of the other side of cash, the accounts payable, plus then the receivables. Then outside of the general fund, we would have bonds and borrowing, the mill levy overrides, bond tracking. And then sort of overall, once we talk about the nitty gritty of the financials, then we talk about the audit and internal controls. So we'll walk through just quickly each one of those individual pieces, which align to the monitoring report. When we monitor fund balance and reserves, we talk about the main pieces, the ones that are restricted, the ones that if you're looking at Tabor multi-year obligations, we set those aside. If it comes to Tabor, the CFOs of the state all agree that there is absolutely no way in which we could spend our Tabor reserves. Tabor reserves in the Constitution say that it can only be spent on unforeseen events. Well, if we can think about it right now, it's no longer unforeseen. If we can think that a meteorite may hit Earth and take out one of our buildings, now it's no longer unforeseen. And we literally think that's how ridiculous this piece of the Constitution is. So we don't even, it's very specific as to salary increases. It says salary and people are not an unforeseen obligation, which if our general fund is about 90% salaries and benefits, there really isn't anything that we can think of across the state where we could actually spend Tabor reserves. Our multi-year obligations have to do with our retirement incentives or our retirement agreements that have stopped, but we still have those legacy agreements for people who do retire we would still owe those and need to pay them out. The next two, we can only spend the money on what it says we can spend the money on. We can
Hey,
only
Aaron,
spend
sorry,
the,
just a quick question.
sure, like,
With COVID, was there any discussion or was there any tapping into the reserves for any COVID related spend, whether it was PPE for people or whatever? I just got a curiosity
no.
to understand the rules around Tabor. Was that considered, eligible, or was it even in that case considered not an unforeseen incident?
Certainly was not unforeseen because we have had those types of events in the past. And it also helped kind of on the flip side to know that we didn't really need to use Tabor because we were full of federal ESSER funds and the
Okay,
coronavirus relief funds.
got it.
When we had our CFO meetings, we all agreed that there wasn't a COVID related expense that we could use Tabor funds to pay for.
Yeah, thanks.
So the next two then is just our bond redemption money is the mill levy for the bonds, and the flip side of that is bond proceeds. Those are restricted by the contracts that we sign with the bondholders, and food service set by federal regulations. Any money that goes into the food service fund can only be used for food service operations. We cannot transfer any money out of the food service fund other than a small indirect fee, which we charge the nutrition fund. Then we do this next piece, and this next piece is important because I think a lot of people think, why do you have all of these reserves when we talk about capital projects? And I say, if we didn't have a reserve for capital projects and we needed to replace a roof, then I need $1 million, which is 10 teachers. And if it happens middle of the year, I need 20 teachers, the equivalent of. So if I don't have a reserve for those types of known contingencies, we'll have to figure out how to pay for those out of the general fund, which we don't want to do. Pupil activities, athletics money, I think you can imagine base money, which is tuition for base. Those we just keep in their individual funds. We do keep an individual fund for risk or instructional resources. Instructional is another good one to think about. We don't adopt a new curriculum every year. When we do adopt a new curriculum, $6 million. So I don't want to have to go to the year in which we adopt a curriculum and have to find $6 million in 1 year. But if I have in building and maintaining that reserve, what I then know is I don't have to cut general fund spending in order to adopt a curriculum. Hopefully that makes sense. It's just making sure that for those known expenditures that we know will happen, we have funds set aside so that we don't have to make drastic changes to our normal general fund in order to pay those expenditures.
Excuse
Then
me,
the board
can I ask
has,
can I ask one quick question? I'm sorry, Aaron, this is really great information. So I know we have to set aside these Tabor reserves, but I guess I'm confused. What can we spend the Tabor reserves on?
nothing,
Basically nothing?
nothing.
Mhm.
So we just sit on that money and we use it for the good of the students?
That is correct.
Okay,
It-
I guess I assumed reserves meant, for a rainy day, and that there were things that we were allowed to spend them on. I did not realize how restricted those reserve funds were. Thank you for clarifying that.
Can
And
I
that
ask a
is-
follow-up question on that as well?
Sure.
With the Tabor reserves, is there a cap at all or any sort of ceiling where funds over that amount can be allocated for something else? Or potentially is that reserve allowed to just grow indefinitely?
So I should have mentioned that Tabor reserve is a 3% reserve. And that's all we keep it at. So we only move or maintain those 3% reserves in Tabor. That's all we do. Otherwise, we move it. It's either going into unassigned fund balance or we assign it to a specific piece then where we would have the option of spending those funds. Hopefully that makes sense. Yes, we cap Tabor. It's both a ceiling and a floor. It's 3%.
Okay, that helps, because in my mind, I was just imagining this enormous fund growing over time that was untouchable. So that's good to know that it has a cap.
And Tabor, just to get a handle on where it is in the Constitution, applies to all governments, including state government. So the state also has a Tabor reserve. Anything over the Tabor cap, we get money back. So there is that Tabor cap, both from a Tabor cap perspective for amounts that they can collect, but also a Tabor reserve that they are required to keep. So when we talk about Tabor at the state level, there's really two different meanings. One is the revenues of the state can only grow by inflation plus population growth. That's it. That's the Tabor limit. At the same time, the state must maintain a Tabor reserve of 3%. So when we talk about the state's Tabor, the one that everyone talks about is the amount of funds they're allowed to collect. And that is over the prior year, not 3%, over the prior year inflation plus population growth. The same applies to school districts where it's inflation plus the change in enrollment, unless the school district has what was called debrucing. So the person who came up with Tabor from Colorado Springs, his last name is Bruce. So it's called debrucing. I don't think he likes that we call it debrucing, but it is the name. Almost all school districts in the state have debruced, which allows us to keep funds above inflation plus pupil growth. What has happened at the state level, if you recall, over the years, there have been debrucing ballot measures, which would change the Constitution. You may also know that those have never passed, not anywhere close to passing, which means that the state cannot retain funds above inflation plus population growth, which is why we get our Tabor refunds. So two different limits at the state level, both of which impact us. The pieces that are not restricted, not assigned, are then unassigned. The board is requiring an unassigned fund balance of no less than 4% of our general fund revenues. And that, again, is to protect against, and this is best practice language, unpredictable volatility of both revenues and unpredictable volatility of expenditures. So while we would think that that is exactly what we would want Tabor to do, it isn't. That is why we have an unassigned reserve that would then say that will hopefully that 4% would then guard against that potential volatility. Do we have volatility? Yes, think of the floods. While FEMA, in their brilliance, came in and attempted to help school districts and other governments, the state has still not received all of its funding from FEMA. There are metro school districts that have not received all of their money from FEMA. So essentially the state is saying they'll never get FEMA money. So their unassigned reserve, which they say is 15%, so the state maintains a 15% unassigned reserve. Ours is 4%. Okay. So that, and really, I think of all of 2.4, of all of the audit, of all of budgeting, when we talk about beginning available resources in budgeting, this is what we're talking about. So it's very good that we have these questions on fund balance. We believe while revenue, of course, is important, expenditures obviously are important. This is the beginning available resources where we start talking about the budget. Let's go to the next slide. The next huge bucket of 2.4 is just managing cash, our investments, and liquidity. The board has a couple of different requirements, all of which I think you could see where we would want them. The first one is a little bit difficult because here it's the seasonal fluctuations of property tax collections. This year, from the time that they changed property tax collections, starting in July, which is the fiscal year, from July until March, all we receive is an equal state share, which is the state share of our per pupil revenue. Then, so if you think about our cash balance would be a declining cash balance because we're getting only state share and our expenses remain the same, pretty much flat every month. So our revenue or cash balance continues to go down until we get property taxes. Then it's a hockey stick and we get our cash balance goes right back up. This year, finally, the state is going to pass a measure that will take our School Finance Act and take all of our revenues and straight line that revenue, which means we will no longer have this decline where we don't have a match between our revenue and our expenditures on a monthly basis. The other good part is that means we're going to have our average daily cash balance will be higher, which will increase our investment earnings, which is really good right now. It really isn't all that good. If you look back a couple of years when interest rates were, I don't know, less than a basis point, I think. So it was really, really small. So obviously, there are times in which we may not meet that over 30-day period. It's generally very rare. We would meet that in February and January and February, which is right before we receive the property taxes. That's generally historically where our cash balances, liquidity have been its lowest. Then March 10th, all of a sudden, our cash balance goes right back up and we receive somewhere around $40 million on March 10th. So it's a significant infusion of cash. A couple of other things. The second bullet, whether it was in there or not, we are statutorily limited in how we can invest our monies. Yes, we follow the statute. There is no way in how we invest our money. Each of the banks in which we invest our money know this rule. They're not going to allow us to violate this rule. They know the limitations. We know the limitations. It just won't happen. Within the allowable investments, however, we do want that prudent investment standard, which is we want to maximize earnings while also maximizing liquidity. Someone mentioned rainy day funds or savings account. That is really not what fund balances are. Fund balances are really just a mathematical equation, and our overall cash position are those assets of cash and investments, while assets overall include receivables and inventories, which obviously are not cash and are unspendable in that function. where cash is then only one component of that overall fund balance. So if you think about fund balance includes excess assets over liabilities. That excess and assets obviously includes a lot of different things that are non-cash. Okay. And restricted fund balances are equivalent to restricted cash, which means what we see on the balance sheet for restricted fund balance, that's essentially always cash. The monies that we have in unspent bond proceeds, the money that we have in tax collections for bond redemption, that is essentially, for the most part, our restricted cash. And we can move on to the next slide. Here, I think we can speed up just a little bit because I think we all understand, even in our own world, accounts payable, the bills that we have to pay, the bills we haven't paid yet, and receivables, the collections for which we have yet to collect. And so the biggest receivables are really grants, because we do a grant reimbursement request. So we spend the money and then ask for it back. That becomes a receivable. We generally get grant monies back in 30 days. Sometimes it takes longer. And that is all up to the state. Almost all of our grant receivables are grant receivables from the state, from CDE in particular. A small amount of receivables relate to student fees or tuition. This obviously, and so where we think there's a lot of overlap with 2.4, and we've mentioned to the board where maybe we look at 2.4 again, we work with all of you in looking at 2.4 and really saying some of these really overlap. Because when you're talking about accounts payable and receivable, you're talking about cash and liquidity. Because if you're not collecting the money, or you're not paying it out, or you're paying it out faster than you're receiving the money, that is all related to, and very closely related to, liquidity and reserves, which we saw in the last slide. Okay, Gina, I think we can move to the next slide. Bonds and borrowing. Guess what? We're going to borrow money and we're going to pay our bonds. We would be in trouble with not only Moody's, S&P, and Fitch, which are all the rating agencies. We would be in default of our bonds. That's not going to happen. So it also means that we're maintaining the cap of our borrowing levels and that the board has to approve the bond. No matter what, this was going to happen anyway, because in order to issue the bonds, the board has to do quite a few resolutions in order to issue those bonds. We do track all of the bond proceeds separately so that we can spend it on the resources for which the bonds were issued, and then same with the COP issues as well. So on the overrides, those all supplement our overall original funding. And as the board adopts the budget every year, they ensure that we're spending our revenues on the priorities of the district. You might imagine that we may have had a priority in, can't remember when we passed the first mill levy, 1994 or something like that. We may have had a priority in 1994 that is 30 years later no longer a priority. So the language of the mill levy allows for that. And you can imagine that we wouldn't want to continue setting aside mill levy money for a program that we no longer do, because it's either no longer successful or we found a better, more successful program. So the board adopts those goals. The board adopts how the overall budget is spent, which includes those mill levy override funds. We'll talk more a little bit later and more specifically, as Gina mentioned, about the latest bond or the latest mill levy, which is a little bit easier to track because that was the most recent mill levy, where those priorities of the mill and why we passed that mill still live today. But one of the requirements of the mill was to replace card readers or security readers at every school, I think was one of them. Well, it's hard to say that we're going to do that every year because once we've done it, it's done. So if we said we were going to use the same amount of money on something every year, well, we're not going to do that. And so once we've done it, then we redirect the proceeds that continue to come into other priorities. Okay, Gina, you can move to the next slide. Audit compliance. All of you already know this because you've seen the independent audit and you know that we work with Clifton Larson Allen, CLA, in order to do our audit, and they also do the required, in fact, the federally required single audit of expenditures of federal grants and federal awards. The board is the entity that hires the independent audit firm. We do not hire them. We work with them, obviously, but they work for the board. They do not work for me. They do not work for Gina. They get to make us angry sometimes, or they get to make us really happy sometimes. They can make our life, keep asking for more information and more information. But at the end of the day, they report to the board and not to anyone in finance. The audit does audit the district's internal controls, and they issue an opinion as to those internal controls. That is part of the single audit. The last piece of audit and internal controls is also audited as part of internal controls by the auditors, and that is all of our RFP processes as both aligned to GFOA recommendations and aligned to the requirements of federal grants and federal grant reporting. Both nutrition and then other grants have very specific requirements for RFPs based on the dollar amounts involved, how many bids we must go out and receive, etc. The other piece on the audit is actually hiring the auditor. And it used to be that the Government Finance Officers Association, GFOA, to which we belong, recommended that you switch audit firms every 4 to 5 years. There are fewer and fewer audit firms in Colorado and in fact across the country that have the expertise to audit school districts. So GFOA changed their recommendation and best practices to say now, instead of changing audit firms every 4 to 5 years, we would ask the audit firm to change its lead, either partner or its senior manager on, what do we call it? Because for whatever reason, I just had a brain freeze. As they work with us on our audit, they would then change up who is the lead auditor, who is the lead manager. And we've been very successful in working with CLA and doing that. And then I think that's all of the slides. Is that all the slides, Gina?
Hey, Aaron, just a quick question. I was looking at the financial statements. Admittedly, I don't look at fund accounting financial statements very often, so I'm used to more traditional, commercial financial statements. From a banking perspective, from a treasury perspective, can you just give us a quick overview of how you guys operate? Do you have revolvers or short-term lending instruments that are available for your use, or is it just purely, funds collected go into cash accounts and that's the extent of your liquidity?
Great question. So I'll answer that in 2 components. One is We invest our funds in Colo Trust, which is an overall investment trust, and many school districts across the state invest their funds in Colo Trust. It is public. It's owned by PFM, which I'll forget what that acronym is. I think it's Public Funds Management, but I'll forget. And the other piece that where we invest our funds is we invest our funds with US Bank, but those investments are generally through our financial advisors, which is PFM, who is part of Colo Trust. And then we're also required to have separate trust accounts for bonds, for example, and those are held all by UMB. And those are invested by UMB based on the overall standards, and our financial advisor helps us look at the bond redemption fund overall, because we don't obviously need those proceeds all of the time because we're only paying principal and interest twice a year. So they help us with that. Generally, we are okay with liquidity. We have the funds available where we don't have to borrow funds or any sort of short-term revolving credit facility. So we have those funds. We also do not, while we invest some of our monies in short to longer term, 3 to 5 year maturities, we ensure, working with our advisors, that I'm never going to be in a place where I need to borrow money because I have money in a 3 to 5 year maturity vehicle. I don't want to all of a sudden sell that at a loss. The flip side of that, Mike, is the state offers an interest-free cash flow loan program to all school districts, which means throughout the year, if a school district needs to borrow funds, they will borrow funds directly from the bonds issued by the short-term bonds, they're 1-year bonds issued by the state, and we can then borrow that money interest-free. We then would pay it back. I think, as I said, that as our liquidity drops towards January and February, we could borrow against that state's interest-free loan program. We haven't, I don't think, in recent history. I don't know if we ever have. I don't think we've been in a position where we've need to utilize that facility. Denver is the largest, by far, largest user of that facility. Boulder uses that facility, and in fact, many more school districts every year are using it because property taxes are becoming a larger component of everyone's overall cash flow. So we're good that we have that. And of course, we would pay back that interest-free short-term loan once we receive property taxes.
Right. So when I'm looking at the monitoring report, I guess what I'm interpreting then from what you're saying is when you guys use the term liquidity, you're really only referring to cash reserves. Available lending is not calculated in your liquidity calculation.
That's correct. Because our lending facility is essentially limited to, is actually as high as our School Finance Act total program. So it's a quite large, we could, the state sets the total value of that bond in about May and June based on everyone's requests for those funds. And that facility has a couple $100+ million in it right now.
Got it. So as long as your budget and your planned spending doesn't exceed the annual amount of your revenue, you could always, for seasonal purposes, you could borrow against that and then have it covered. I got it. Okay. That makes sense.
And
thanks.
We had every school district in the state also has a legal opinion that says we can do that, because if you look at Tabor would require voter approval of any borrowing.
Right.
And the legal opinion is as long as we pay it back within the same fiscal year, it's not really borrowing as it's required by Tabor.
Got it. That
Not
makes
sure.
sense.
It's
That's
a little
helpful.
crazy, but it's also how the state can get away with it because the state is issuing short-term debt without going to the voters asking to be able to borrow money.
Right.
So this is great conversation, but we are a bit over time on that section. Aaron, do you want to take, and you've touched on it a little bit in the presentation, but the 2.4.5 penalties and late fees, do you want to touch on that really quick?
2 minutes, and of course I can run right into these because we've talked about them. 2.45 says that we will not allow a vendor to charge us penalties. Okay, well, as our general counsel said, that's not possible. What happened is, and the reason that this came up is our friends at Excel Energy have lots of changes and very short-term staffing, and they had been charging us late fees. And we found out that the reason they're charging late fees is they're not cashing all of our checks. And they're saying then that that's our fault. It isn't. So we've paid somewhere around $1,100, $1,200 in late fees, but we will receive all of those back from Excel Energy, and we're working to resolve that with them. A little crazy. Receivables, this again, the majority of receivables outstanding are either grant receivables, which we clear, but what we generally tell the board is about student receivables. And those are student receivables for student fees as well as nutrition and for base. As you all know, students are eating for free now. So there is little to very, very little receivables in student nutrition. And under the fees, as we have more and more free and reduced kiddos, a lot of those fees are waived. So while we have them, and they, as you can imagine, at the beginning of the year through December, the receivables balance increases because those fees are being charged and they're not yet being paid. Historically, then they are paid in the second semester. If they're not all paid, the district a while back, 7, 8+ years ago, did send parents to collections, and we no longer do that. We had stopped that practice, I think 7 or 8 years ago. Made up time.
You
That's great.
did good. I knew you could cover those two a little bit faster. So we have Jeff Ohm has joined us. I know that was a ton of information, and when we're done with the information from Jeff and Bo, if we've made up some time, we can circle back if you have any additional questions. And of course, you're always welcome to shoot myself or Aaron emails. So Jeff, I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Yes, I see that Jeff, you're here. So Jeff, oh, and there he is. He's on camera. So Jeff, go ahead, introduce yourself. And he is here to talk about the 5C mill levy spending for device refresh.
Sure. Hello. Can you hear me, Gina? Okay. Hold on a second. I gotta see if I can get my screen sharing thing fixed here. My settings are wrong. Oh, Gina, I may have to send you this deck to share, which I will do right now. So I am Jeff Ohm. I am the Executive Director of Technology Strategy and Delivery in IT. So my team, let me get back to Zoom. Sorry about that. So my team in IT, we are sort of like our project management office. So we deliver, we manage all of our devices in the district, so student devices and staff devices. And also deliver all of the IT bond projects and most of the safety and security projects for the district. So that's like, you think about like door access and security cameras and fun things like network switches and the fiber network, all of that kind of stuff. And then we also manage the instructional materials. So think about like math workbooks and things like that. So that's a little bit about me. I don't know how these normally go. I think these are probably, this is like 10 minutes. So I'm kind of like, I don't know kind of how the timing works. Gina, you can go to the next slide. It's a little bit discombobulating since Gina's driving for me. So just in terms of scope, and what I tried to do is kind of focus this on what you would need to know from the FAC side for 5C and sort of what that 5C allocation for student device refresh goes to. So I think probably everybody knows, but we have a one-to-one Chromebook program for all of our students that was established in 2021. So formally established, it was sort of informally established during the pandemic when we sort of scrambled around to give everybody a Chromebook so we could do remote learning. And then we formally continued that program in 2021 and secured like funding and all of those good things. That was not the original intent of the 5C allocation in the 2018, I think that was. Is that right, Gina? 2016, 2018? Because we didn't have a one-to-one program at that point. So at that point, that 5C was intended to remove a technology fee that was just a generic technology fee that we charged the students before that. And after the pandemic and with the establishment of the EdTech program, we kind of repurposed that into supporting student devices because now we had student devices out in student hands. So the way the program works at a high level is every student has a Chromebook that they can access for in the classroom or take home if they're grades 3+. The K2 classroom they all have carts with a device individually assigned to each student for them to use in the classroom, and they don't take those home because it's really hard for the littles to haul those things around. Once they get to 3rd grade, they get their own device that we plan on them keeping for 4 or 5 years. Is sort of the life that we're seeing in devices right now. And then they keep that same device. And so they take it home at night. They can take it home during the summer and use it for enrichment programs during the summer, so on and so forth. So as a part of this program, or as a part of the Chromebooks that we supply, we also supply Chromebooks to schools for community use. So that's like if we have families that don't have any technology at home and they want to come pay fees, or they want to log into their portal account to see how their students doing, we have those available in offices. So students that are community members at any school can come to any school and borrow one of those devices. So all told, that amounts to about 43,000 Chromebooks across the district that we manage. And Chromebooks right now, we're in the process of going through the purchasing process for our Chromebooks for next year, which happens in this fiscal year. Chromebooks are about $370 per device. That's kind of, and like I said, we expect to get 4 or 5 years out of that device. We're getting better. Students are getting better at taking care of their Chromebooks, and we're more purposeful about good digital use training or encouragement for students so that their devices last longer. Okay, Gina, you can bump to the next one. So this gets more related to the specific 5C allocation and sort of how we manage that fleet once we get them. So when we started this program, we did a lot of analysis on how do we secure these, how are we going to be good asset stewards for these devices. So we looked at external insurance programs, which were pretty expensive. We looked at what other districts were doing, and we settled on sort of creating our own self-insurance program for those, or for these devices. So how that works is, instead of going to a third-party vendor for what we'd say insurance, is every student pays $20 per year, and then that $20 is basically aggregated to repair any devices that get damaged over the course of the year. And in order to account for free and reduced, we discount that $20 fee, $10 for students who qualify for reduced lunch, and then students who qualify for free lunch don't pay that fee. So what happens then is, like, if I'm a student, I paid my fee, I drop my Chromebook, and it shatters or whatever. The first time that costs the student $5. So there is, like, think of it like a copay with insurance, like if you get an offender bender or whatever, same kind of deal. It's like it's $5 for their first one, and it escalates up to, I think, $25 for the second one, and $70 for the third one. So we don't have that many that get into most of them are accidental devices. So it costs a student $5 to repair those. How that 5C comes into play is that allocation that we get each year allows us to discount. That kind of covers the amount that we discount the fee for the free and reduced students. So I think that allocation changed a little bit about each year. I think it's roughly $160,000, $165,000, something like that. And it kind of dovetails in with our free and reduced percentage, so that we are whole in terms of what our insurance program works, or how it works. And essentially, a device, a repair cost right now for us is $75. So we have a vendor, which is the last bullet on this slide. We have a vendor that we send our repairs to. We probably have 2,000, 2,500 repairs per year that we have to do. That costs $75 flat rate per repair. And so that aggregation of all of those insurance premiums help us pay those fees and keep a discounted damage down to the student. So one of the things that you probably notice, if you look at that budget, or that the balance of that line item in our project budget this year, it's a lot. So what's happened is, this coming out of last fiscal year and going into this fiscal year, we've had to transition our logistics vendor for Chromebooks. So what that means in reality is that our repairs have stacked up over the course, all of the sort of think of the broken devices at the end of last school year, plus all of the broken devices that happened in this last fall, have all built up. So we haven't had a repair vendor to repair our devices. And so then we've kind of, that dollar amount has collected over time. We just created our first, we're in our first quarter of having them do repairs, and I think we have a PO out there for $160,000 or something like that. So what happened is that money just got caught up in the transition of one vendor to another vendor, and now our new vendor is in place and starting to repair devices. So in terms of the appropriate amount for that allocation, it dovetails really nicely with our free and reduced percentage to allow us to kind of keep doing this self-insurance program. So that's like really all I have. I think I'm 1 minute over, and I know Aaron was talking about making up time. So I don't know if you all ask questions in these things. I'm 100% happy to answer any questions about it. If you need to move on, because I think Bo is up next, totally understand that too. And always feel free, you can shoot me an email or give me a call, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Hey Jeff, I have a question. With that backlog of repairs, do you have like I guess on hand inventory then of Chromebooks so that students are not out of pocket for learning?
Yes, that's a very good question. Yes, we totally do. And so what the other sort of the plus side of not having that repair vendor is we haven't been able to distribute Chromebooks out. So last spring we purchased 7,000 Chromebooks. And so those 7,000 Chromebooks it's like, think of it like the shell game, like we've moved them from one place to another place. And now we have that inventory on hand to pump those back out to the school, so that, we've never had in terms of the program, and knock on wood, we've never not been able to give a student a Chromebook to use. And we have plenty of inventory on the backlog side because of the same transition, to be able to keep the schools populated with, or keep the schools with an inventory of Chromebooks. So the way that works is every school has sort of their own reserve inventory. What we're typically, it's been a fixed number. We're starting to try and right size our fleet. And so it's really, we're toying around with somewhere between 7 and 10% of their student enrollment. And they have that many extra devices on hand, because every day someone like Jeff forgets his device and he doesn't have one. And then he can, I can go to the library and get a device that I can use for the day and turn back into the end of the day or not. So good question.
Is there any recovery, at time of disposition of those assets? Is there any like recovery cost or, scrap value or anything like that,
It's a good question, because Gina and Aaron and I have a meeting this afternoon to talk about that specific thing. Not really. As you can expect, I think we've probably, I don't know, it's maybe been like $1,500 over the last few years. I think what's happened is when the pandemic occurred, every K-12 organization in the United States was trying to buy Chromebooks. And so we're stuck where we have a huge amount of supply of devices that are reached their end of life, and not as much demand as there was before, but we don't get much. And a lot of them, by the time we cycle them out of a student's hands, they're pretty worn out. Like they're, as you can well imagine, you can well imagine they get wear and tear for, someone that's between, 10 and 18 is a lot harder than probably any of our devices see.
Oh yeah. It's 12, so I fully understand that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Jeff. FAC team, if you guys have any additional questions for Jeff, please feel free to send them my way, and I will get those to Jeff and reply back to you. Sorry, today's just a jam-packed agenda, so I apologize for that. Jeff, that was awesome. That was really informative. Thank you so much for being here, and we will move on to Bo. Hi, Bo.
Thank y'all. Have a good day.
Thanks, Jeff. Do you want to introduce yourself, and do you want me to share anything, or do you want to share from your screen?
I'm happy to share. That's fine.
Thank you.
As long as you've given me permissions. Good morning, everyone. For those of you that I haven't had the opportunity of engaging with or meeting yet, my name's Bo Fobert. I serve Adams 12 as Chief Academic Officer, and I'm here today to give you an update on 5C spending buckets that are specific to things we do in learning services, which are all things connected to the classroom here in Adams 12. So I will refresh myself on screen sharing here in Zoom. Let's see. Gina, it's asking me for some permissions here. So if you're able to pull up that document, that would be great. So as Gina's pulling that up, I'll give you just the quick executive summary, which is largely, we've got these 5C buckets fairly dialed in learning services. As you'll hear shortly, many of these specific areas within 5C are areas we use to staff specific positions in our system. And we're very fortunate that we're able to maintain those staffing levels. Although, as you'll hear, we have had some inflationary pressure with staffing costs outpacing the inflationary adjustments that 5C mill levy is able to provide for us. And it's forced us to make some decisions around moving folks from 5C into the general fund, or as you'll hear today, from one 5C area into another. That's it, Gina. That's great. Perfect. So the first a bucket, and one that will see some new pieces come each year and a couple fall off, but is largely static, is the 5C area that's related to curriculum and instructional materials for our system. So I've broken these down for you here by different content areas, or if they're content agnostic, there's several applications that we use around the delivery of content that fall in this instructional technology lane. But you can see here what our big expenditures within the 5C instructional materials bucket looks like. It's important for you to know that the 5C portion of instructional materials is not all inclusive of the instructional curriculum work we do as a system. We have a separate fund that is not 5C generated that also is utilized for curriculum and instructional needs throughout the system. I shared with this team last year, and I'll reiterate it again, there's been a significant shift over the last few years for resources that are either 100% digital or hybrid, with some textbook or tactile workbook materials, and also with a digital component. That shift has some pros and cons. The pros are that it allows for content to be updated more easily and refreshed. Many times when we get textbooks off the shelf, especially in some specific content areas, the information is getting old and outdated almost the moment we scan and enter them into our system. The downside to that is we're reliant on the digital pieces. Over the years, most companies have gotten better about addressing outages or access issues. Our IT team does a wonderful job of making sure students and teachers can easily access those digital resources, but there's been a definite shift in that space. Gina, if you'll scroll down a little bit, the only other piece I'll expand on here, that's good to know if you can keep going to the top of this second page here, is there is a call out for newcomer curriculum. And if you've been following the media, following news in Adams 12, we have seen a significant influx of newcomer students throughout the Front Range and in Adams 12, really over the past year, but especially over the last several months. And for our newcomers, they require obviously scaffoldings of curriculum that are very different than what a native English speaker or someone who is growing up in America needs. And so we've had to very quickly add, especially at the high school level, where you have really sophisticated and nuanced content, some scaffolded resources that help our newcomers come in and navigate some of the language and cultural barriers that get in the way of being able to fully tap into learning at the high school level. So that's a new expense, one that will continue, I think, as we make sure that we have the right resources and supports in place to ensure that the newcomers to our system have what they need to thrive and excel. I also want to call out in this multi-tiered systems of support, this data dashboard. This is a new and significant addition to our system. Heretofore in Adams 12, we have had no problem procuring a lot of data. We keep data on attendance. We keep data, obviously, on grades, on graduation, discipline events, individualized education plans. We have lots of data, but those data had been housed in a variety of different places, and there was not a kind of uniform and user-friendly access point for folks in our system to tap into that, to really look at different triangulations and aggregations of data that would allow us to make really smart strategic decisions about supporting individual students, groups of students, entire grade levels of students. This data dashboard, which we call 5-Star Student Insights, is really allowing us to move from being data rich, but sometimes information or strategic poor, into really being able to leverage that data to make day-to-day decisions that meet kids' needs at the moment of need. And so that's a huge piece. We've started to roll that out in a handful of schools. By next fall, it'll be in use throughout our system, and we'll continue to add to that over time. but it's going to create a tremendous amount of efficiency and precision in our system as we think of serving kids. The next several pieces here then really start to specify investments in staffing in our system. So obviously you as our FAC team know that FTE is full-time equivalent. 1.0 FTE captures a staff member, and you can see this bucket has been very set for a number of years with the number of interventionists that we're able to provide in our elementary schools and K-8s to support reading and math intervention, and then a coordinator here at the district level. Again, 5C is not exhaustive of the interventionists we have in the system. We use different funding sources to provide over 40 academic interventionists in our system. You can see 5C here only provides 17 of those. We tap into a lot of other resources to provide the intervention that we believe is necessary to support kids at our elementary and K-8 schools. Gina, if we could keep scrolling. And so this piece here is no change from last year. We are using this money to provide more pathways for teachers to serve as leaders in the building via instructional coaches. So you can see starting in fiscal year 23, we got to a point that we're allocating instructional coaches at every level of our system. There's been no change in this piece. We have some fund balance in this that allows us to continue to do this years into the future. The number of coaches we have in here at some point 4 to 5 years out, at that fund balance gets drawn down, we will have to make some choices on maintaining this, hopefully through future investments. But for right now, this bucket can sustain this program for the next several years. No changes here, just continuing to implement this throughout our schools. Gina, we can go forward again. So this piece, these two pieces here, really important to look at side by side. I don't know why the formatting is a little bit off here, but this first box, if you will, really speaks to, again, FTE investments in our school that are designed to support the mental health and social emotional well-being of students. So this is a mix of counselors in our system, social workers in our system, or a hybrid role that we call social emotional learning specialist, or a CEL. You can see we have many FTE out of this bucket that are in our system. And I've added this note here that captures what I mentioned earlier, that the costs of these FTE are outpacing what the 5C inflationary adjustment provides to us. And so we have had to, in recent years, move some folks out of this bucket into other funding sources, typically general fund. Recently, we were able to use some federal pandemic money to sustain some of these. But moving forward, we're going to have to get creative in how we sustain the support in our system. One way we can do that is actually in this next bucket. And again, I apologize for the formatting shift here. I'm not sure what happened. But this next bucket is curriculum resources specific to supporting teaching around mental health or social emotional well-being. Because the curriculum does not need to be refreshed every year, we are starting to accumulate a fairly healthy fund balance in this particular bucket. And we believe it is in the spirit and the intention of this 5C work around social emotional health and well-being for both the curriculum and the staffing to work side by side. So one of the things we are looking at and are likely to propose in the near future is using some of the fund balance in this curriculum account to pay for some of the social emotional learning specialists, counselors, social workers that are being squeezed out of that bucket above that specifically mentions FTE for staffing. We'll continue to be able to refresh the curriculum as needed, but rather than just have a kind of unspent fund balance, we'd rather continue to maintain and ensure the availability of teachers that support social emotional learning and wellness in our system. The preschool piece is no change. We added those several years ago, continue to maintain that. with universal preschool, now in place in Colorado, it's likely that a future mill levy is going to contemplate additional investments in preschool as we continue to add capacity so that we can make preschool available, ideally, in my view, in every elementary and K-8 school in our system. We're not quite there yet. Next bucket is CTE work. This is a huge point of pride for us as our system. We now have taken this bucket as far as it will go. You'll see another note here that we were able to expand some academic integration that allows students to get math and English credit while at our CTE campuses. This is a real scheduling benefit for kids because they don't have to go back and forth between a home high school and Bowman or Washington Square to be able to get core content credit, allows them to explore more of their CTE pathways. All of this FTE could not be supported in this bucket. We've maxed it out. So some of this 4.6 FTE is actually being funded through general fund. And again, future CTE expansion beyond 5C is going to require other investments from the community moving forward. So that's the rundown of Learning Services 5C buckets. I know that was really fast. I got a text that we're running a little bit behind, so I tried to speed up my overview there. But like Jeff, certainly happy to answer questions because I did go over all that very quickly.
Hi, I have a quick question. It sounds like we're able to sustain most of the programming. Is there one area that, unless I misheard, that we're very concerned about a shortfall, or are we able to juggle and shift things to meet our needs meet the needs of the students and staff?
Great question, Kathy. I would say for fiscal year 25 next year, I feel comfortable that we're able to maintain all our investments we've had to date. Beyond that next year, if we don't get either through an adjustment in school finance at the state level or additional operating dollars via a mill levy override, we're going to have difficulty keeping up with just the labor costs, to be frank. The costs, especially for some of these more technical teaching roles, counselors, school psychologists, social workers, diesel mechanics, auto body repair mechanics in our CTE lane. I do have some worry that at some point we're going to have a hard time stretching these dollars to maintain the FTE in those areas. Programmatically, from the materials standpoint, whether it's social emotional learning curriculum or just our core content elective curriculum, feel pretty comfortable there. Looking into the forward, we're not seeing nearly the inflationary impacts that we are just in labor costs.
Okay, thank you. That's good. I think it's important for all of us as ambassadors to know of the school district, to know that, just to start letting people know when we're talking to other parents that if we want to maintain the quality that we all love Adams 12 for, that comes with costs, and that we have to be looking at how we're going to continue funding these things further into the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and I really appreciate that sentiment, and obviously want to continue to report back to you that we're being thoughtful and stretching what we have as far as we can and as thoughtfully as we can.
Oh yeah, no, I've seen that. That's one of the biggest lessons I've learned being on this committee is how I don't want to say frugal, but how diligent the staff is on stretching every dollar.
It's a good word. Thank you.
We are only 1 minute over right now on where we were supposed to be. Bo, you did an excellent job speeding up. So I think if there are other questions for Bo, we absolutely can take that time. All right, I'm not hearing any, Bo. That was really informative. Thank you so much for being here today. Gavin, we can go. Thank you, Bo.